discussion of the topics for today, as Mark said, the roles and responsibilities. It's so important for our safety partners in the net to understand the responsibilities going forward. And I also understand that, you know, some of the regulatory requirements are a source of a concern, and so I'll touch on that a little bit too as I get a little further into the presentation. So looking at our agenda for today, flip slide.
No, I think we're good, Joe.
Okay. So the agenda for today certainly is the, you know, I'll take a look at a couple of the definitions so we understand those. I'm then going to look at certification bodies, certificate holders, and contractor roles and responsibilities. And then we'll have some time for a QA. And then we're going to talk about the, you know, a little bit, we'll tell you what we're planning for the next webinar. So looking at first definitions, the first one that I'd like to go over certainly is with respect to the definition of a contractor. A contractor means a person who carries on in whole or in part the business of installing, removing, repairing, altering, or servicing appliances, and includes a person or agent of the person who agrees to install, remove, repair, alter, or service appliances sold or leased by the person. So again, you know, it's important to understand that that's you know, what the definitions are and what we would look at as terms of who a contractor would be going forward. The next one I just want to touch on is is approved. And approved means with respect to a standard or laboratory report that's listed, it's in the titles and standards test reports authorized in the province of Ontario under the Ontario Gas Utilization Code. So for example, in this particular case, all the adopted and approved standards reports and publications you can find in section 2 of the B149 that TSSA adopts. With respect to an appliance or equipment, component, or an accessory, that it bears the label or symbol of a designated testing organization or a label or symbol authorized by the director certifying that it complies with an approved standard or a laboratory test report. So, and then with respect to the installation or work, obviously that it complies with the regulation. And so I'll go through the presentation, and in a moment I'm going to show you some of the, you know, the labels and symbols that you will come across in your travels and your work. But just understand there are two ways to gain approval in the province of Ontario. One is through certification with somebody such as CSA, or the other is through a field approval by TSSA, and I'll touch on that a little bit later on as well. So these next couple of slides will show you the some of the certification bodies in Ontario. These are approved certification marks for Canada, but for gas and oil-fired equipment and their components. The following agencies accredited for fuel oil appliances and equipment. So that's the Canadian Standards Association, Underwriters Laboratories, Underwriters Laboratories of Canada, the PFS Corporation, Omni, and Intertech testing services. All the others are gas only, and some of them have very much a limited scope. So if you're looking at symbols, which I'll show you in a moment, the C refers to approvals for Canada, and the US obviously is for approvals for standards in the United States. There are a number of standard writing organizations and certification agencies in Canada. They are all accredited by the Standards Council of Canada, and in fact they must be accredited by Canada, Standards Council of Canada, to kind of carry on that work. And so if you're looking, it'd be similar to somebody being registered as a contractor in Ontario, is that all these companies must be certified with SCC. So these next few slides I'll show you just are a number of the various symbols that you will come across in your travels. And so there's the CSA ones there with the various symbols they use. The CJ, the Canadian Gas Association ones that you may still run into from time to time, but those are now already part of CSA group, and so those would be on older equipment or gas components. ULC listed, and those would also, you would also run into. And then for gas fired, you'll see UL listed there for Canada and US, and the various symbols that UL will use in their particular certification work. We then have ETL, which is Intratec, Warnock Hershey are all combined in there that are also accredited. OTL, ES, PMG, PFS, QAI, and LC. And so the scope of some of those is, are more for manufactured and mobile homes, and you're less likely to run into those, but you perhaps will in your travels. And then the RADCO is they have no certification in Canada right now, but they are recognized. So I'd like to now just move on to the key focus of today is to look at the primary roles and responsibilities. And so this is intended to clarify contractor and certificate roles, and really at a high level go through the 6 regulatory responsibilities that our certificate holders and contractors have today. So I've chosen, this is the particular sections out of the Ontario Regulation 212. Again, it's for natural gas, but it's similar wording in the other regulations as well. And so for our purposes today, I'm going to use 212 for our discussions. So the 6 primary requirements are for general requirements for compliance under Section 3, prohibited activities under Section 4, certificate requirements under 6, duty of the employer under 11, and then the duty of to report unacceptable conditions, both immediate and non-immediate, and then the last one is the requirement for contractor registration. So looking first at the general requirements for compliance, every person engaged in an activity, use of equipment, process, or procedure to which the Act and its regulations apply shall comply with the Act and the regulations. For the purpose of subsection 1, the reference to activity is the use of equipment, process, or procedure, but it's not limited to design, installation, alteration, repair, service, removal, purging, activation, storing, handling, modifying, or using. And so pretty much if you touch it, you probably have some responsibility to make sure it's in compliance. So the first one, fairly straightforward. We must comply with the Act and the regulations and the codes that are adopted through the legislation. But I would point out to you that there is an alternative in that if you can demonstrate equivalent safety, TSSA would consider a variance, and we do that quite often. And so, for example, a couple of the common ones that I see come across my desk is clearance to rooftop equipment. Very often we run into situations where the equipment's much closer to the edge than 6 feet required by the code, and so we need to demonstrate equivalency and safety. So generally they'll apply to have guardrails put up to protect the technicians who happens to be working on the roof. Also, another common one we get has to do with the change from ABS to 636 venting piping a number of years ago, where the if the venting system is concealed, and if the various prerequisites are met in terms of looking at the first 5 feet and pressure testing, we will then look at a variance to leave the existing vent system in place. Moving on to Section 4, which is prohibited activities, where this regulation requires the approval of an appliance or equipment or thing, no person shall offer for sale, lease, rent, or install an appliance, equipment, or other thing unless it's approved or will be approved prior to be putting into use. So what this means is that all of the equipment must be certified by one of those agencies that I showed you on the previous slides, or they must be field approved by TSSA. And so the owner operator then must submit a design to TSSA for review, and then have the equipment inspected for field labeling by the TSSA inspectors. And just to note, in Ontario, TSSA is the only organization that can conduct field approvals. So some of the other jurisdictions across the country do permit third-party field approvals, but Ontario we do not. And then just turn to the bottom right there, you'll see an example of a field approval sticker that would go on. A lot of them that we do has to do with the mobile food service equipment, such as your food carts and your hot dog stands, and none of those are certified as a complete unit. And so the engineering group looks at the designs, and then inspection makes sure that they do comply with that. And when they do, then they apply that label to the equipment. So if you don't see a label such as CSA or UL, you can look for to see if the TSSA field approval label is on there. Certificate requirements. No person shall install, alter, purge, activate, repair, service, or remove any appliance, equipment, or other thing employed or to be employed in the handling use of gas unless the person is the holder of certificate for purpose. And so what that means is if you're working on equipment that's, you're looking at small domestic furnaces and water heaters, probably sufficient for you to have a G2 certificate. But if you're getting into the larger, over 400,000, into the larger commercial industrial, then you're going to be required to have a G1. Just as information for you, in Ontario, we have 34 different certificate types, plus what we call ROTs, or records of training, and then very specific IMT programs that we have for, generally they're for industrial and manufacturer types who have very specific work that we accredit their own people with. So Ontario regulation 215.01 lists all the certificates in Ontario and what the requirements are and the scope of the work within those. I can tell you that there are some exemptions under section 55 of the 215 reg. And so, for example, installing or servicing in a detached dwelling that is owned and occupied by a person. So as kind of king of your own castle, you could install a gas piece of equipment, but you must have it initially turned on by a certificate holder. Installing and servicing portable equipment for your own use that does not serve the public, absolutely is within, would be an exemption for that as well. Also, duct cleaners are exempt as long as they're not touching, anything else. And then the final one, which is a fairly new one, is the assembly of a consumer product in a retail outlet. So this is the big box stores, or any store for that matter, who offers barbecue assembly service, for example. So you buy a barbecue at one of the big box stores, and they offer to assemble that for you, provided they have showed us their training package and that their people are trained to that. They are exempt from holding a certificate for that purpose. Moving on to the duty of employers. Every person who operates, installs, removes, repairs, alters, or services appliance or work shall instruct their employees to comply with the Act and the regulations. So, and then every person who employs a person to carry out the activity referred to in 1 shall take every precaution that's reasonable in the circumstance to ensure that your employees do in fact comply with the Act and the regulations. And so, I often get asked, so what's reasonable and what should I be doing to protect myself? And so I could offer, there's several options, but I can offer a couple. So if, you should be, and when you do training of your employees, or if they're taking training, record that, and so that you can demonstrate that, you've kind of done your due diligence to ensure that your people are properly trained. Again, and part of that, I guess, would be to audit their work from time to time, ensure that their certificates are valid and not expired or suspended. Those are just a couple of ways that you could make sure that if something does go badly, that you've kind of demonstrate that you've done all you could to prevent that from happening. The contractor audit program, some of you may or may not be aware that Sandra Cook has been going around to some of the chapter meetings and talking about that. And so there will be some further discussions on that in the future. Only to just basically to say that the focus on that change in that program will be less field-based and verification and more focused on demonstration of compliance, which kind of fits in with what I just talked to you about in terms of the duty of an employer. So this next area I want to get into is talking about the duty to report. So this is when you are involved or encounter an incident such as carbon monoxide poisoning, asphyxiation, explosion, or fire, and that has occurred because excuse me, has occurred because of the use or storage or handling of a gas. A certificate holder, ROT, contractor, or a distributor shall forthwith notify an inspector of the occurrence by telephone, fax, or any other electronic form of transmission, and the contractor and the distributor shall have procedures in place for such notification. So what that means is you, in terms of notifying inspector, that really just means you're notifying TSSA, and I'll show you how easily we can do that in a minute. The second part of that is no person shall interfere with or disturb any wreckage, article, or thing at the scene of an occurrence as connected with it except in the interest of public safety, saving a life, relieving human suffering or continuity of service, or preservation of property. And so what I would say is if you have to disturb something, there's a couple of things. First, when you're reporting it, ask that you need to speak to the TSSA inspector or the whoever the supervisor is on call, or whoever the supervisor is for that. And then also, I would say take pictures of any of what you're looking at, so that when we do get into the investigation part of things, that we'll have evidence of what was going on at the time. This is just a bit of an excerpt from the guidelines, but the full guidelines are posted on our website at TSSA, and I would encourage you to kind of review those and be familiar with that. So the reporting guidelines themselves, or the incident reporting criteria. So and just as a bit of background, I mean, every year many incidents involving hydrocarbons really fit into the requirements provided by the regulations, but reporting every situation to us really doesn't provide a lot of value. So the guidelines themselves will help clarify when or when not you should be contacting TSSA. I know there's been some confusion about surrounding the how to notify forthwith, or in terms of notifying TSSA right away. So it really means right away, or absolutely as soon as possible after. If I don't expect you to leave something unsafe to kind of run and call, but you should be getting to us just as soon as you can. So that's just a bit of an intro, and like as I said, the full guidelines are available on the website, but the regulations do require reporting for when it's apparent that the following things are happening. So carbon monoxide poisoning, asphyxiation, explosion or fire, or an accidental release, vent, leak, or a spill. So any of those things you should be reporting to TSSA. So just how you go about doing that is that TSSA has an agreement in place with the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks, and that's their Spills Action Center, to receive notifications under the Act. So we have a contract with the Spills Action Center, and they will all reporting of any of these hydrocarbon issues that I just talked about. You can make through the Spills Action, and they can be reached at the two numbers that you see up on the screen there. They are available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for reporting an incident. And if you do report to the Spills Action Center, because we will get a report, that allows you to meet your regulatory requirements for reporting incidents to TSSA. So quick call to either one of those numbers up there. If there's a need to disturb any article at the site, you may wish to speak to a TSSA representative, just advise the spills action operator that you need to speak to somebody from TSSA, and they'll either get the local supervisor or inspector, or who, if it's after hours on weekends, they'll get the duty supervisor to give you a call and answer any questions and provide any direction. So that any of that, following that procedure above, certainly will satisfy your regulatory requirements. And from TSSA's perspective, we always have somebody on call. So if you need some advice after hours or on the weekends, there's always somebody that TSSA can get in touch with to be in touch with you and provide whatever assistance you may require. So, and the third part is where it is permitted to interfere with or disturb a record, an article, or other thing under the subsection 2, no person shall carry away or destroy any wreckage, article, thing unless the inspector has given permission to do so. So basically, it's okay to move things, just don't remove them. And again, I would ask as possible to take pictures. As you know, you can see in this one where this was a small commercial plaza in Mississauga, and we lost a third of that plaza to an explosion. And those are some of the situations that we run into. And if things need to be disturbed, pictures help a lot when we're trying to carry out our investigation. So as I said, here again, it's just a slide that shows you the numbers that you can call for the Spills Action Center. And as I said, they're open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and they'll receive your calls and ask you for certain information, and then they will then pass that along to either the on-call supervisor, TSSA, or if it's during the day, it'll go to the tech desk and they'll be in touch with the inspection team to make sure that somebody looks into it. So now moving on to duty to report. So these are the unacceptable conditions, and I think this is probably one of the most common heard pain points, I think, from contractors, in that they, you know, it's in some cases having to report on their own customers, their own clients, of things that they see are non-compliances, and then your client then is required to make repairs or do whatever. Fortunately, it is a regulatory requirement for all certificate holders. So what I like to do is just, you know, spend a couple of minutes and go through the requirements, and then talk to you about what my expectations are and how you can fulfill your regulatory requirements and not get yourself into any issues. So the first, under section 13, is immediate hazard. It's fairly straightforward. You run into a situation where you're finding that appliance or work is in an unacceptable condition that's immediate hazard. Could be, you know, badly deteriorated venting. It could be a badly deteriorated heat exchanger on a furnace. Any manner of things that, you know, the customers or the public is immediately in danger of, you know, carbon monoxide poisoning or you know, explosion, any of those kind of hazards. You then have certain activity or actions that you must take. So immediately shut off supply of the gas to the appliance. Promptly give oral notice of the shutting off of an appliance to the distributor. Give written notice to the user, describing the condition that constitutes the immediate hazard, and directing that the appliance or work not be used until the condition's been corrected. And then within 14 days of finding that situation, you must give written notice of the condition to the distributor, including notice that the gas supply has been shut off, and then affixing you know, a notice or a warning tag to the A or B tag to the, or A tag in this case, containing information required in C to the appliance or the work. Now, I will say that, you know, there is a requirement to immediately shut off these things. You do have the option, if the customer is agreeable, is that you can make the repairs on the spot if you wish. I mean, so if you find you know, a venting system, for example, that's an immediate hazard and you're going to shut it off, you know, in the dead of winter, the customer might be agreeable to having you do the repair. So certainly that is an option for you. But if they choose not, you have no choice then but to discontinue the supply at that appliance and tag the unit and advise the customer accordingly. For the non-immediate, you know, kind of the same criteria applies, where a holder of the certificate, or sorry, a holder of a certificate or an ROT finds that an appliance or work is in an unacceptable condition, but not an immediate hazard. Again, there's certain actions that you must take, but there are a couple of other options too. So immediately give oral notice of the condition to the distributor who supplies the gas. Immediately give written notice of the user of the appliance or work describing the condition and advising that the condition has been given to the distributor. Give written notice of the condition to the distributor within 14 days of finding it. And then again, you must affix a B tag with the information required in B to the appliance. And so, and as I mentioned in my webinar last month, that certainly would ask that please make the tags provide as much detail as you can. I get it, some of them are small, and please make it legible, because it just, if it just says non-compliant, it really doesn't help anybody. So, I mean, as much information as you can fit on there is helpful, and then make sure that you advise the customer as well. And then section 4 of that, which is not actually on the slide, is on a non-immediate or a B tag situation. You do have the flexibility to set the time frame for when the non-compliance should be corrected. Now, in some cases, some fuel distributors have guidelines out there, and it's totally okay to follow those. So if somebody, if a particular distributor had a 42-day guideline, totally okay to provide that. And then they have the option to, if a client needs more time, to go up to 90 days, at which time generally I'll get a request for an extension if they need more time. And there are some situations where in the winter, for example, piping on a roof or things, not much can be done up there, and so they really need to go until spring before they can do work. But you do have the and we are just shortly we'll be putting out an advisory on this particular situation, and clarifying that who has the responsibility to set the time frame, and as the person or the technician there servicing the appliance, you're probably in the best position to determine that, and so we'll put that out there to them. I do know that this is a pain point for a number of the contractors, and that the feeling is you're writing up your own customer. Unfortunately, it is the law. So let me just clarify a little bit about what my expectations would be as the Director of Fuels, is that if you're working on a piece of equipment and there is another piece that's in the vicinity of where you're working. So, kind of the classic example is if you're working on a furnace, generally the water heater is right next to it. If you eyeball the water heater and you see a problem with the venting, I would expect you to identify that and advise the customer that there's an issue with the water heater. On the other hand, though, if you're working on an appliance, I wouldn't expect you to search the house for the fireplace in the bedroom or the unit on the roof if you're not working up there, just to look and see if there is non-compliances. So if it's where you're working, I expect you to do that and identify it and tag it as necessary. I know that I from time to time I do get complaints from customers who call me up and say, geez, I had so-and-so in here, and he tagged me for the chimney and it wasn't anywhere near where he was working. And I said, so my job then is to try and convince them or show them that you were actually doing your job and keeping them safe. And so I get those from time to time, but I can tell you that anytime, if there's a legitimate reason for a tag and they call me up, I will back it up every time and say that you're carrying out your safety duty under the regulations. So I do get those complaints. I do recognize it's the feelings out there. Martin and I have talked about this several times, but like I said, unfortunately, it is the law of the day, and we all face with that responsibility. So this next slide, I just wanted to show you an example of a non-compliance, and I know I could, if we had the speakers on, we could probably hear the chuckling out there. This is an actual situation that one of our folks ran into, where they were driving down the street and they saw a customer with that and just had to pull over and get a picture. And of course, after we got the picture, we did advise them that probably wasn't the best practice to the best use of propane, but it just gives you an example of some of the things we run into out there. So let me just kind of move on to contractor registration. No person shall act as a contractor unless the person is registered for the purpose, similar to a certificate holder. We do have on our website for those registered contractors and people who are looking for somebody, they can go onto our site and there is a search function there on our website to help them find a contractor if necessary. So this is for registered contractors out there. I will say too that I'd like to just add right here that we're very much interested in people who are not registered and using non-certified people to do work. Absolutely, we take those very seriously. And if you have information of people you know are of that, ilk, I guess, what we refer to as the trunk slammers, perhaps. But if you're aware of people out there, happy to hear from you about that. We will follow up on it, and we take a very strong position on that and kind of move those along to prosecution very quickly, because we're really trying to make sure that only qualified registered people are working out there. So there are exemptions, I guess, to the requirement to being a contractor, and I'll go through those. Is that a person is exempt from the requirement to register a contractor if the person acts as a contractor only by selling to a customer an appliance to which Section 55.5 Ontario Regulation 215 applies, and by employing or directly through an agent a person to assemble the appliance for a customer's where the work of the person is assembling the appliance qualifies the person for exemption described in Ontario Regulation 117. So what that is what I talked about a little earlier. This is the intended for retail outlets that are offering assembly services for consumer products such as barbecues, and that they aren't required to be registered as a contractor, and their employees, their trained employees through a program we've looked at, are also not required to hold a certificate, but can only work within the scope of that. If they leave the employ of that company, they are no longer qualified to do anything. So this was one of the exemptions we have out there. The other one we have is I guess employees who work exclusively for whoever. So employees who perform work exclusively for their employers on equipment owned by the employers do not need to be registered. So for example, school maintenance staff who work on the school boilers and nothing else would not be required to be registered as a contractor. They still need to hold the certificate, but they just don't need to be registered as a contractor. And so there is that exemption for people like that. And I would also say that we've had situations where contractors are working for a particular contractor exclusively, and so would fall under that contractor's registration. And as long as you stick within that, that's fine. But if you stray out of that or decide you're going to do work on the weekends on your own or anything like that, then you are required to register your company as a contractor. Okay, but that there are a couple of exemptions are available under certain circumstances. So that was that one exemption had to do with the store. The second part of this is really to deal, it's the same wording whether they're, but this one applies more to the individual exemption for that employee of the retail outlet who is assembling barbecues, for example, are not required to hold a certificate or be registered. And that, so that kind of concludes the technical aspects I'd like to cover for today. Certainly, I think we have a few minutes that we can answer a couple of questions if there are some out there.
Yes. So on the topic of questions, I'd just like to remind everybody that in the control panel on your screen, there is a link in which you can type in questions. I have received a question here from Pamela. Pamela has asked, and I'm paraphrasing this, in reference to slide 6, if we could go back to slide 6, that would appear to leave it open to homeowners to do some work after the technician leaves. This is challenging to protect ourselves against this. Is there anything we can comment on there? Absolutely,
that was a good question. So yes, absolutely that can happen, because as I indicated, their only requirement is that, so for example, if a homeowner chose to put in an appliance of their own, as long as it's turned on and checked by a certificate holder, that would be quite acceptable. What I would suggest to you, and we do this all the time now. I know the guys are when they meet with contractors and they get involved in incidents or complaints, is to take pictures. If you've done an installation, absolutely take pictures and document that. And then if something does happen later where somebody else has changed the installation or done something, you then can show our people, here's what we did and here's what we left behind, and it will protect you.
Okay, any additional questions from anybody at the moment? Okay, great. Is there a code referencing that you have to be certified by 636 in order to install their product, or is it a manufacturer's requirement only?
No, there's no regulatory requirement for 636 specifically. Generally, there are certain manufacturers who do provide I don't want to say certification training, but provide training for their products, and certainly would recommend that you take those if you're dealing with that kind of a product. The regulatory requirements for a certificate holder is that generally and the understanding is you would be trained for the work that you're doing. So, for example, if you're a G1 and you're going to do work on large industrial equipment, the hope would be that you would be trained on that stuff and just carry out work that you do that you've been trained for.
Okay, we have a question regarding slide 7. You mentioned an approval that is US only, but mentioned it is acceptable.
So generally, if you find a label that has both the C and the US, then it would indicate that there is a acceptable for both Canada and the US. Or if it's just a C, it would be Canada only. For the US label, the labels would be acceptable for US or studied to a US standard. But I'll provide a little further clarification on that one a little later.
Sorry, folks, we're just having a small technical issue here. Okay, so the question is.
Just trying to open this up. Sorry about that.
Oh, there it is. That's better. Okay.
So, is there a code reference when we did that one? So
That's one.
this one here.
Okay. Right, so slide 7. You mentioned approval is US only, but mentioned it's acceptable. Homeowners who do their own work and then require a certificate holder, should this person need to be a contractor? Also, not just a certificate holder. So do they need to be a contractor, or can they just be a certificate holder?
No, you should be a contractor and a certificate holder if you're looking at doing work and certifying an installation. You absolutely should be a certificate holder as well.
Okay. Scott asks, how do large box stores get away with selling gas-fired water heaters?
There's no problem with somebody selling water heaters. I think generally what they do is they do provide, I guess, referral services for contractors who do the installation. But if they're just selling the product and not installing it or not holding themselves out as the installers, then they would be okay not to be registered.
So John asks, curious to what the role of the distributor is. As far as selling gas-fired equipment, should they be verifying if the contractor is certified to perform the installation of what is being purchased?
So, sorry. So this is the role of this. So this is appliance distributors. I don't think that there's a regulatory requirement that prevents anybody from buying a piece of equipment. So, for example, the the homeowner that I talked about in the previous exemption for slide 6, a homeowner could go to a distributor and buy equipment, but so we can't prevent that. So it would be nice if only registered people could buy equipment, but that's not the case today.
We have a question from Liz, actually at TSSA, and it's my fault, Liz. I'm the one who messed up the screen.
Oh,
As I said, technical glitch. And then let's go down a little bit further. The regulation mentioned anyone involved in an activity has a responsibility. What about engineers who design systems, what have you? So as per the regulation, anybody touching,
so yes, anybody doing any of those activities that I touched on in that slide, which is pretty much everything, have to be, they have to be a certificate holder and or a registered contractor to do that kind of work. Engineers, if they're doing that work, they're not exempt just because they're an engineer for carrying out the work of a certificate holder.
okay. Matt asks, is it acceptable to convert an oil-fired residential boiler using a certified conversion burner without having it field approved? So certified conversion burner without field approval.
I'm going to qualify that one, say not necessarily. You have to look with the manufacturer may have a list of approved burners or acceptable burners for their particular unit. And so you might have to do some checking with the manufacturer first. Otherwise, you may have to get a field approval.
And one more, can a homeowner buy and install parts in order to repair their own gas-fired equipment?
Yes, they could. It falls under that other exemption I talked about with homeowners, that they can do work once it's been activated by a certificate holder.
Scroll down. Can you just? Why do engineers design systems that don't comply?
Okay, so why do engineers design systems that don't comply? What options does TSSA have?
I'm not quite sure what you mean there. If they don't comply, I mean, equipment, anything sold in the province of Ontario has to be certified by one of those organizations or field approved by TSSA. So I'm not quite sure if that answers your question, but anything is certified in the province.
And then there's who's responsible in it.
Yeah, who is responsible in installation, for example, of a furnace? The gas technician who installed it, or the company owner, which is the certificate holder as well? So in the case of a furnace installation, who are the most responsible parties? The gas technician installing it, or the company that he works for?
Well, in this particular situation, you've got a scenario that could be a little bit complicated. It really depends on what we find during the investigation. So if we went, for example, went and looked at and found a fault or an occurrence or an incident, we would look at the circumstances, and if the employer, for example, had done everything within their power to make sure that their employees complied, did all the right things that they were supposed to do, but then the technician either didn't follow those or made some error, then we would be probably looking at the individual. We've looked at both, or in some cases we might look at both of them and make them both partly culpable, but it really depends on the circumstance. It could be either one of them.
Okay, and that would appear to be all the questions we have at this point. So thank you, John. Thank you, everybody online. Appreciate you joining us today. I hope everybody's found this session to be informative. Remember, the webinar has been recorded. A copy of the recording and presentation will be sent to all registrants shortly after we sign off. For those of you who submitted questions that we were unable to address, please send your questions to mrippon@hrai.ca. I'll include that in the package that you get afterwards, and we'll make sure that they make it to TSSA in due course and see if we can't get the answers for you quickly. We'd very much appreciate your feedback and comments on today's presentation, as well as any suggestions for future topics. Please take a few minutes to complete the evaluation survey that will appear on your screen at the end of the webinar. So this ends our presentation for today. We look forward to having you join us again Thursday, February 27th for the third presentation in our webinar series, when our topic will be Contractor Audit Program, as presented by Sandra Cook, TSSA Ombudsman. Have a great afternoon, everybody. Thank you again for joining us.